Imagine a chamber lit only by the trembling glow of torches. The smell of iron and damp stone clings to the air. A young girl's scream echoes through the fortress walls before it is abruptly cut off. In the silence that follows, the drip of blood on cold flagstones becomes deafening. And at the center of it all, dressed in black velvet and pearls, stands a woman whose beauty was said to be eternal, her pale face serene, almost divine. To her followers, she was a countess of refinement. To her victims, she was death itself. And to history, she would become known as the Blood Countess, a woman whispered to have bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. But who was she really? A monstrous vampire in human form, a product of political conspiracy, or something far more unsettling, a noblewoman who weaponized cruelty in ways medieval Europe had rarely seen before. This was no ordinary tale of aristocratic excess. This was a nightmare come alive. The year was 1609. The Kingdom of Hungary stood as a bulwark between the Christian West and the encroaching Ottoman Empire. Wars had drained the treasury, famine haunted the peasants, and whispers of witchcraft, and the devil lingered in village folklore. Against this backdrop, Elizabeth Bathory ruled her vast estates with absolute power. She had inherited wealth, lands, and soldiers from one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. Her marriage had only cemented her influence further. To her tenants and servants, she was untouchable, her word, law, her whims, fatal. But in the shadows of her castles, from Chete to Sarvar, another story was unfolding. Servants vanished. Daughters of peasants entered the countess's halls seeking work or patronage and were never seen again. When rumors finally escaped the fortress walls, they spoke of torture chambers, of maidens drained of blood, of a woman who believed that only the lifeblood of the innocent could preserve her beauty. At first, these were just whispers carried on the wind of fear. After all, Europe in the early 17th century was a continent obsessed with witchcraft trials, demons, and vampires. But soon, even nobles could not ignore the bodies, or what was left of them. And yet, what makes Elizabeth's story even more chilling is that not all of it may be true. For behind every legend is a kernel of political reality. Was she truly a vampire who bathed in blood, or a powerful woman destroyed by enemies who feared her influence? Tonight, we plunge into the darkness of one of history's most infamous figures. A woman whose crimes or accusations blur the line between history and horror. And as we peel back the layers of legend and fact, one thing becomes clear. The real story of Elizabeth Bathory is far more disturbing than the myth, but the real horror was still to come. Power is rarely quiet. In the kingdoms of Renaissance, Europe, it was loud, it was violent, and it was maintained through fear. Elizabeth Bathory understood this better than most. Behind her, noble grace, lay a cold calculation. That terror was the sharpest weapon a ruler could wield. As the mistress of vast estates stretching across Hungary and Slovakia, Elizabeth commanded hundreds of servants and peasants. Every loaf of bread baked in the village, every tithe of grain brought in from the fields, passed under her watchful eye. But unlike other noble women of her time, she was not content to rule passively. She had grown up in a dynasty where violence was as common as prayer, where cruelty was both entertainment and politics. In such a world, compassion was weakness. From the very start of her rule, Elizabeth cultivated fear. Servants whispered of her temper, how a misplaced thread in her gowns or a stumble while brushing her hair could unleash her wrath. But unlike other noble punishments, Elizabeth's were not confined to slaps or dismissals. The punishments were designed to humiliate, to break, to remind those beneath her that they were nothing more than playthings of her will. Witnesses would later recall stories of beatings so savage that servants collapsed, of needles plunged beneath fingernails, of girls stripped and left in the snow, doused in freezing water, their screams echoing through the courtyard as their mistress looked on. Each act was a performance of dominance, an assertion that she, alone controlled not only the lives, but the dignity of those in her service. And the peasants, bound by law and poverty, had no recourse. To speak against her was unthinkable. To resist was to invite death. What made her cruelty more terrifying was its ritualistic nature. Servants reported that punishments were often repeated, not merely to correct mistakes, but to savor the spectacle. Some girls were locked in cages with spikes that pressed into their flesh if they moved. Others were smeared with honey and left outside to be consumed by insects. These were not quick executions. These were drawn-out displays of power, rituals, in which suffering itself became the Countess's language of control. It is here that legend begins to seep into history. Later rumors would transform these punishments into acts of vampiric thirst. Elizabeth supposedly drinking or bathing in blood. Whether true or not, what cannot be denied is the atmosphere of sadism and paranoia she cultivated. In her world, the line between discipline and horror blurred into something unrecognizable. But cruelty alone does not explain her descent. Elizabeth was also a woman living in a man's world, surrounded by enemies who eyed her wealth and influence with suspicion. With her husband often away at war, she ruled her estates alone, an unusual position of power for a woman of her time. Whispers of witchcraft, of unnatural appetites, easily followed. Paranoia seeped into her halls. Every servant was a potential spy, every visiting noble a possible betrayer. To Elizabeth, control was not just about authority, it was survival. If she showed weakness, she would be devoured by rivals. And so, her punishments grew harsher, her rituals darker, her reliance on fear absolute. She trusted only a handful of attendants, women as brutal as their mistress, who carried out her commands without hesitation. Together, they became the instruments of her paranoia, turning the fortress of Chejte into a house of whispered terror. Yet, even as she seemed invincible, cracks began to show. Peasants muttered about the disappearances of their daughters. Rumors spread from village to village that to enter the Countess's service was a death sentence. Local clergy raised concerns, though carefully, knowing her rank could shield her from reproach. And nobles, jealous of her fortune, began to take note of the whispers. For now, Elizabeth was untouchable. But her cruelty had set in motion forces she could not control. Every lash of the whip, every body buried in secret, tightened the noose of suspicion. And soon, her carefully constructed world of power and fear would spiral into scandal so dark it would shake Europe to its core. But the real horror was still to come. It began with a scream, not the cry of battle, not the weeping of a punished servant. This was the scream of a girl realizing she was about to die. Inside the fortress of Chejte, the Countess had summoned yet another young maid into her private chamber. Some versions of the story say the girl was a village peasant lured with promises of work. Others claim she was of noble blood, a young daughter of the gentry sent to learn etiquette at the Countess's court. Either way, she was trapped. The chamber was prepared. Iron restraints gleamed in the torchlight. Implements of torture lay ready. Needles, pincers, whips. And at the center of it all stood Elizabeth Bathory, her pale hands adorned with rings, her eyes sharp with a hunger that witnesses would later describe as inhuman. The girl was stripped, her clothes tossed aside like rags. Elizabeth began with the small cruelties she favored, pinching the flesh, striking with a whip until welts blossomed. But this was not enough. The Countess wanted blood. Witnesses at her later trial described one infamous ritual in chilling detail. A servant would restrain the victim as Elizabeth produced a thin, sharp needle. She would drive it under fingernails and toenails, laughing at the girl's sobs. Then came the knife, cutting shallow lines into the skin, on the arms, the shoulders, even the face. The purpose was not immediate death, but agony, a slow bleeding that turned the chamber into a stage for suffering. And then, according to the legend that would outlive her, Elizabeth bent close, touched the blood, and smeared it across her skin. Some swore she even licked the wounds, tasting the iron tang of life itself. Others would later claim she gathered the blood in basins, immersing herself in it as though in sacred water, convinced it held the secret to eternal youth. Whether truth or exaggeration, what no one could deny was that young women went into her chambers and never came out alive. But Elizabeth did not always act alone. She was surrounded by loyal attendants who indulged her cruelty. Dorothea, Ilona, Katerina, women whose names became synonymous with brutality. They held down the victims, fetched the tools, even suggested new forms of torture. In this court of horrors, cruelty was a bond, and blood was its currency. Sometimes Elizabeth's husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, participated in these rituals before his death in 1604. Known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his own savagery in war, he is said to have taught Elizabeth techniques of torture he had used against Ottoman prisoners, such as rolling strips of oiled paper between the toes and setting them alight. Together, they turned sadism into a pastime. But with Ferenc gone, Elizabeth's cruelty grew unchecked. The victims were not nameless in the eyes of their families. They were daughters of peasants, promised wages that never came. They were servant girls, beaten into silence. And eventually, they were daughters of the minor nobility, sent to Chejte to polish their manners, only to vanish. This escalation was Elizabeth's fatal mistake, for while peasants' disappearances could be ignored, noble blood could not. When young ladies of standing began to vanish, whispers spread like wildfire. To the peasants, she was a demon who drank blood. To the nobles, she was a threat to the very fabric of their society. Imagine the court of servants forced to watch as their mistress carried out these torments. Some complied, terrified of sharing the victim's fate. Others assisted eagerly, feeding on borrowed power. All were trapped in a cycle of terror where silence was survival. And beyond the castle walls, rumors spread. Villagers spoke of bodies buried in shallow graves, of carts seen at night carrying corpses wrapped in cloth. Clergy received whispered confessions from terrified servants who fled. Step by step, the horror grew too large to be ignored. Was Elizabeth, driven by vanity, desperate to preserve her beauty in an age obsessed with youth? Was she a sadist who delighted in pain for its own sake? Or was she, as some historians suggest, the victim of exaggeration and conspiracy? Her real abuses twisted into myth by enemies eager to see her fall. Whatever the truth, the spectacle of cruelty became her signature. She turned pain into ritual, fear into art, and blood into legend. But legends have consequences, and soon those consequences would come crashing down upon her. For the Countess's reign of terror was about to face the one thing she could not control: the power of scandal at court. If cruelty was Elizabeth Bathory's language, scandal was the echo that carried it beyond her castle walls. Inside Chejte fortress, screams were muffled by stone. But at court, whispers could be sharper than any blade. At first, the rumors were little more than gossip. Servants who fled her service carried stories of disappearances and torments, but such tales were easy to dismiss. After all, Hungary in the early 17th century was a world steeped in superstition. Tales of witches, vampires, and the devil's servants were common currency in taverns and markets. A powerful noblewoman accused of drinking blood might seem more like folklore than fact. But as more noble daughters began to vanish, the whispers grew more dangerous. Families demanded answers. Clergy began to record testimonies of escaped servants, some of which described chambers of blood and mutilated corpses. These stories moved from fearful mutterings to official reports. And in the tense politics of Hungary, where noble families were locked in bitter rivalries and the crown itself was weakened by war, such rumors were weapons. Elizabeth's family, the Bathorys, were among the most powerful in Central Europe. They had produced princes of Transylvania, military commanders, even kings. Their wealth and influence stretched from Poland to Hungary. For her enemies, destroying Elizabeth was a way to strike at an entire dynasty. Among those who took note was Count György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary, a man tasked with maintaining order in the kingdom and a loyal ally of the Habsburg monarchy. Thurzo had long distrusted Elizabeth's power. Her vast estates and independent authority made her a dangerous figure in a region already threatened by Ottoman incursions and internal instability. And so, when whispers of her atrocities reached him, Thurzo saw not just horror, but opportunity. The church, too, had a role to play. Christianity in the early 1600s was deeply concerned with stamping out heresy and witchcraft. The Counter-Reformation had sharpened the church's zeal to root out sin, and tales of Elizabeth's supposed vampirism fit neatly into a narrative of demonic corruption. Priests who had heard servants' confessions brought their fears to higher authorities. To them, Elizabeth was not just a murderer. She was a woman who mocked God, who corrupted innocents, who performed satanic rituals in the heart of Christendom. And yet, the Church's outrage was not entirely pure. By condemning Elizabeth, they also struck at a powerful Protestant family in a region where Catholic and Calvinist nobles were bitterly divided. Thus, morality and politics entwined in the accusations against her. Inside her own household, cracks began to form. Some of Elizabeth's closest attendants, once loyal participants in her cruelties, began to waver under pressure. Fear of their mistress was one thing. Fear of the king's justice was another. When Thurzo's men began questioning witnesses, these servants confessed, sometimes eagerly, sometimes reluctantly, detailing punishments, tortures, and murders. Each testimony painted a darker picture, but they also shifted blame. Elizabeth was the orchestrator, yes, but her inner circle ensured the rituals ran like clockwork. In turning on her, they hoped to save themselves. Their betrayals would seal her fate. By 1610, the scandal could no longer be contained within whispers. Reports of Elizabeth's crimes reached King Matthias II himself. The king, deeply indebted to the Bathory family, now faced a delicate problem. To ignore the rumors was to risk rebellion among the lesser nobility whose daughters were vanishing. To confront Elizabeth outright was to challenge one of the most powerful dynasties in Hungary. And so, a plan was formed. Thurzo, acting in the king's name, would investigate, but not quietly. He would make Elizabeth's downfall a spectacle, one that would remind every noble family in Hungary that not even the most powerful were beyond the reach of crown and church. In December of 1610, Thurzo arrived at Chate Castle with armed men. What they found has become the stuff of nightmare. Some accounts claim they caught Elizabeth in the act of torture, blood still staining her hands. Others say they found corpses or half-dead girls writhing in agony. Whatever the exact truth, Thurzo wasted no time. Elizabeth's accomplices were arrested. The Countess herself was placed under house arrest, her once feared authority crumbling in an instant. And just like that, the whispers became a roar. At court, nobles gasped at the tales of her cruelty. Pamphlets and chronicles spread stories of the Blood Countess who bathed in virgin's blood. What had once been rumor was now scandal on a continental scale. But here lies the irony. The very nobles who denounced her were themselves no strangers to brutality. Torture, executions, and cruelty were woven into the fabric of their world. What made Elizabeth different was not simply her violence, but her gender, her independence, and the fact that she had dared to direct her horrors at those of noble blood. In exposing her, the court also exposed its own hypocrisy. Behind their outrage was a hunger for her lands, her wealth, her power. Elizabeth Bathory was now a prisoner in her own castle, surrounded not by loyal servants, but by guards. And the stage was set for the trial that would etch her name forever into history. But the true turning point, the moment her world collapsed completely, was still to come. When Countess Elizabeth Bathory was finally confined to her fortress, the echoes of her crimes did not stop at the castle gates. They spread, like poison through villages, towns, and courts. Her atrocities had become more than scandal. They were legend in the making, and legends reshape societies. For the peasants who lived under her rule, the revelations confirmed what they had long suspected. Mothers wept for missing daughters. Farmers whispered of shallow graves hidden in the forest, of bodies smuggled away in carts beneath the cover of night. To them, Elizabeth was no longer just a cruel mistress. She was a monster, a noble woman who fed on the young. Her cruelty became cautionary tale. Children were told to behave, lest the Countess come for them. In villages near Chete, her name was spoken only in hushed tones, as if uttering it aloud might draw her spirit. Fear became part of the cultural fabric. Generations grew up believing they lived in the shadow of a vampire countess. But for the nobility, the impact was more complicated. Elizabeth was one of their own. Her downfall raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of aristocratic privilege. How could such crimes have been ignored for so long? How many noble, and in a region already steeped in vampire lore, the myth deepened. In the folklore of Central Europe, vampires were not yet the aristocratic figures of later Gothic fiction. They were grotesque, bloated corpses that fed on the living. But Elizabeth's legend shifted that image. She became the prototype of the elegant, beautiful vampire, a noble predator who hid her monstrosity behind wealth and refinement. The scandal reshaped daily life in the villages she had once ruled. Parents forbade daughters from seeking work in noble households. Peasants grew wary of serving aristocratic families, suspecting hidden cruelties. Even nobles who had nothing to do with Elizabeth suffered under the weight of suspicion. Local authorities tightened laws on servant treatment, at least on paper. Greater scrutiny was placed on households where disappearances occurred. Whether this actually improved the lives of peasants is doubtful, but it marked a shift. The scandal forced nobles to consider how their behavior appeared to those beneath them. But perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. Elizabeth's crimes, real or exaggerated, tapped into primal fears. The fear of betrayal by those in power, the fear of a predator hiding behind beauty, the fear that youth and innocence could be consumed to feed another's vanity. These fears lingered long after her imprisonment. Folk songs, stories, and plays spread her tale. Travelers carried the legend across Europe, each retelling darker than the last. Elizabeth Bathory was no longer merely a Hungarian countess. She had become the archetype of female monstrosity. And so, society did what it often does when confronted with unthinkable horror. It transformed it into story. The story served as warning, entertainment, propaganda, and myth all at once. It justified religion, protected nobility, frightened peasants, and fascinated outsiders. In short, Elizabeth Bathory ceased to be human. She became an idea, an eternal figure of terror, as immortal in legend as she had once wished to be in flesh. But even legends face a turning point. And for Elizabeth, that moment would come not in whispers or sermons, but in the public spectacle of her trial and final downfall. For years, Elizabeth Bathory's fortress had been a cage for others. Now it would become her own. By 1610, the tension was unbearable. Too many girls had vanished. Too many noble families whispered of daughters who entered Chete Castle and never returned. Peasants spoke of seeing carts leaving the castle under cover of darkness, heavy with wrapped bodies. Clergy muttered of confessions drenched in blood. For decades, Elizabeth's wealth and rank had shielded her. But fear has a tipping point. When it spreads from the powerless peasants to the noble elite, it becomes rebellion. Elizabeth had crossed a line. She had preyed not only on peasants, expendable in the eyes of the aristocracy, but on their own daughters, and for that, she could not be forgiven. Elizabeth still believed herself untouchable, but her inner circle was collapsing. Under interrogation, her closest attendants, Dorothea, Ilona, Katarina, and Janos, confessed to years of atrocities. Some confessed under torture, others with cold precision. They described the beatings, the mutilations, the bodies buried in the castle grounds. But their stories had one purpose: to save themselves by placing the blame squarely on Elizabeth. She was painted as the mastermind, the sadist, the demon, and though they admitted their own roles, they cast themselves as pawns in her monstrous game. The betrayal cut deep. For years, they had been bound together by cruelty. Now, they traded loyalty for survival, sacrificing their mistress to save their skins. On the cold night of December 29, 1610, Count György Thurzó, Palatine of Hungary, rode with soldiers to Szeged Castle. The plan was swift and dramatic. No, more whispers. This would be an arrest meant to send shockwaves through the kingdom. What they found inside became legend. Some reports claim Thurzó and his men burst into the castle to discover Elizabeth caught in the act, standing over a girl's broken body, blood dripping from her hands. Others describe corpses hidden in chambers, and even half-dead victims still writhing in agony. Whether embellished or not, the sight was damning enough. Elizabeth was seized. Her accomplices were shackled. The fortress that had once been her stage of horror was now crawling with armed guards. The Blood Countess had fallen. The trial that followed was a spectacle of confession, rumor, and outrage. Witnesses lined up, peasants, servants, even minor nobles, to tell their stories. Some claimed to have seen Elizabeth bathed in blood. Others described girls chained, beaten, or burned. The numbers were staggering. At one point, a witness accused her of killing 650 victims. Whether this was hyperbole or not, the figure stuck. It entered chronicles, cementing her as one of history's greatest murderers. Elizabeth herself never faced a formal trial. Her family's power was still formidable, and the authorities feared the scandal of putting a noble countess on open display. Instead, her accomplices bore the brunt of justice. Dorothea and Ilona were executed with brutal efficiency. Their fingers, those same fingers that had pinched, struck, and tormented countless victims, were torn off with hot pincers before they were thrown into the flames. Katerina, younger and deemed less culpable, was given a quicker death. Janos, the servant, was beheaded. These executions were not just punishments, they were theatre, meant to prove that justice had been done. But the true mastermind, the Countess herself, was spared public humiliation. Instead, Elizabeth was sentenced to lifelong confinement within her own castle. Bricked up in a set of chambers, with only small slits for food and air, she became a prisoner of her own legacy. For 4 years, she remained there. A woman who had once commanded armies of servants, who had struck terror into entire villages, was now reduced to pacing in circles in the dark. Witnesses claimed she raved to herself, clawed at the walls, or sank into silence for days on end. In 1614, guards found her dead on the floor of her chamber. She was 54 years old. No executioner's blade, no stake through the heart, just a lonely death in the fortress she had once ruled. Her downfall was not just the destruction of one woman, it was a lesson to all nobles of Hungary. No amount of wealth, rank, or cruelty could protect them if they turned against their own class. Elizabeth had believed herself above consequence, but power built on fear is brittle. The moment her peers turned, her empire of terror crumbled. And yet, even as her body was buried in secrecy, her legend refused to die. For the consequences of her reign, the stories, the myths, the horror, would echo for centuries. When Elizabeth Bathory died in her walled-up chamber in 1614, she left behind no public grave. Fearing desecration, her body was quietly moved, and its final resting place remains uncertain. But if her physical remains vanished, her legend did. Not chroniclers of the time painted her as a cautionary tale of female vanity and cruelty. Later, writers exaggerated her crimes, inflating her body count, transforming torture into vampiric ritual. By the 18th and 19th centuries, she was no longer simply a noble woman accused of murder. She was immortalized as the Blood Countess, a real-life Dracula, centuries before Stoker's novel. Historians continue to debate. Was she guilty of hundreds of murders, Or was she the victim of a politically motivated smear campaign? Some argue the blood-bathing myth was propaganda layered onto a story of abuse that was horrific enough without supernatural embellishment. Yet in folklore, fact mattered less than fear. Her legacy is one of duality, a noble woman remembered not for wealth or politics, but as one of history's darkest monsters. Today, Elizabeth Bathory's shadow stretches into literature, film, and pop culture. She is the archetype of the beautiful predator, the vampire queen, the embodiment of power turned to horror. But beyond the myth lies a disturbing truth. Her story resonates because it reflects timeless abuses of power. Whether she bathed in blood or not, she represents how unchecked authority, paranoia, and cruelty can consume the innocent.